Ars Notoria, Episode 6, System Conflict and Dominance. Chapter 2, Engineering the Field. Structural entry points. Understanding systems is not enough, because perception without intervention produces no control. At lower levels, awareness creates clarity. The system recognizes patterns, understands interactions, identifies structure, but it remains external, observing, not shaping. This creates a limitation, because the system can read what is happening, but cannot influence what happens next. At this level, knowledge becomes passive, and passive knowledge does not produce dominance. To move beyond this, the system must shift again, from observation to entry, because every system, no matter how complex, contains points of access, not visible as openings, but embedded within structure. These are entry points, locations where influence can be introduced. Not anywhere, but precisely where structure allows it. At lower levels, action is distributed. The system attempts to engage broadly, multiple points, multiple directions, multiple interactions. This creates dilution, because influence is spread, not concentrated. Most of it dissipates, absorbed by structure without effect. At this level, entry must become selective. The system must identify where influence is accepted, not where action is possible, but where action is effective. Because not every part of a system responds equally. Some regions resist change, others redirect it. Some absorb input without transformation, others transmit it. Entry points exist where transmission is possible, where input does not remain local, but moves. This is the first condition, propagation. If an input cannot propagate, it has no structural value. At this level, the system must evaluate. Does this point distribute influence or contain it? Because contained influence dies, distributed influence scales. This is why most interventions fail. They are placed in regions of containment, high activity, but low transmission. The system appears engaged, but nothing spreads. At this level, effective entry requires mapping, understanding how pathways connect, where signals move freely, where constraints limit movement, where feedback loops amplify input. Because entry points are not defined by visibility, they are defined by connectivity. A point with high connectivity, even if subtle, has greater influence than a visible but isolated region. This shifts attention again, from surface-level interaction to structural access. At this level, entry also requires compatibility. Not every input can enter every system. Each structure has its own logic, its own constraints, its own thresholds. An input that does not match the system's logic is rejected, not actively, but structurally. It does not integrate. It does not propagate. It remains external. This is why forcing entry fails, because incompatibility creates resistance. At this level, influence must be aligned, not just with dominance, but with system logic. The input must match the structure it enters, so that it can be carried by it, not opposed by it. This creates integration, where influence becomes part of the system, instead of acting against it. At this level, entry is not an event, it is a process. The system does not simply act, it positions influence within structure, so that once introduced, it continues to move, without constant input. This creates efficiency, because the system does not need to act repeatedly. It acts once, correctly, and structure carries the rest. This is the beginning of engineering, not controlling every part, but inserting influence at points that shape the whole. At this level, precision matters more than scale. A small input at the correct entry point outperforms large input elsewhere, because structure amplifies it. At this level, failure is no longer about effort. It is about placement. Incorrect entry produces no effect. Correct entry produces disproportion. This is where the system transitions, from understanding systems to shaping them. Because once entry points are identified and used correctly, the system is no longer external. It becomes embedded. And embedded systems influence from within. Insertion versus force. Once entry points are understood, the next mistake becomes obvious. Most systems try to force entry. They apply pressure, increase intensity, expand effort. And when the system resists, they push harder. At lower levels, this feels logical. If something does not work, increase force. If resistance appears, overcome it. This creates a model based on pressure, where influence is treated as something that can be imposed. But within complex systems, force does not produce entry. It produces rejection. Because systems are not passive. They are structured. They contain constraints, filters, thresholds, mechanisms that regulate what is allowed inside and what is not. When force is applied incorrectly, the system does not accept it. It redirects it, or absorbs it without propagation. At this level, force creates illusion. The system appears engaged. Energy is applied. Movement is visible. But nothing integrates. Nothing spreads, because the structure is not compatible. This is why forcing systems fails, not because effort is insufficient, but because placement is incorrect. At this level, insertion replaces force. Insertion is not pressure, it is alignment. Instead of pushing against structure, the system aligns with it. It matches the logic, the pathways, the constraints, so that when influence is introduced, it is not rejected, it is carried. This is the difference. Force attempts to override the system. Insertion uses the system. At lower levels, this distinction is invisible, because both involve action, both involve input, both create movement, but their outcomes are completely different. Force creates local disruption. Insertion creates systemic propagation. At this level, insertion requires precision. The input must match the system's logic, not approximately, exactly, because even small misalignment creates resistance. The system does not need to reject aggressively, it simply does not integrate. This creates silent failure, where action occurs, but effect does not scale. At this level, insertion also requires minimalism, because once alignment is correct, large input is unnecessary. Small input is sufficient, because structure amplifies it. Force depends on volume. Insertion depends on compatibility. This is why smaller, precise actions outperform large, unfocused ones. Not because they are stronger, but because they are accepted. And once accepted, they move. At this level, resistance becomes informative. Not something to fight, but something to read. Resistance indicates misalignment, not weakness. It shows where structure does not match input, where pathways are closed, where entry is not possible. This changes behavior. Instead of increasing pressure, the system adjusts alignment. Instead of pushing harder, it shifts placement, until insertion becomes possible. At this level, efficiency emerges, because the system stops wasting effort. It no longer applies force across multiple points. It targets specific entry locations and introduces influence in a way the system can carry. This reduces friction, because the system is not being opposed, it is being used. At this level, control becomes indirect. The system does not dominate by force, it shapes from within. Because once insertion succeeds, the system itself distributes influence. No additional effort required. This creates scalability, where one correct input produces continuous effect. At this level, failure becomes clear, not from lack of action, but from incorrect method. Force fails. Insertion works. Not sometimes, consistently, because structure does not respond to pressure. It responds to compatibility. And once compatibility is achieved, resistance disappears. Not because the system is weak, but because alignment removes conflict. Adaptive entry. Once insertion replaces force, another limitation appears. Entry is not static. At lower levels, systems are treated as fixed structures, stable pathways, consistent behavior, predictable responses. This creates a false expectation that once an entry point is identified, it will remain valid. That alignment achieved once will continue to work. But within complex systems, this assumption fails, because systems evolve, not randomly, but continuously. Pathways shift, constraints adjust, feedback loops reconfigure. What was once open may become restricted. What was once effective may become neutral. What was once rejected may become viable. This creates movement within structure, not visible as events, but as gradual reconfiguration. At this level, fixed strategies collapse, because they depend on static conditions. They assume the system remains unchanged, so they repeat the same entry, the same alignment, the same method. And over time, effect decreases. Not because the strategy was wrong, but because the system moved. This is where most systems lose effectiveness. They become rigid. They rely on what worked before instead of what works now. At this level, entry must become adaptive, not reactive, but responsive to structural change. The system must continuously evaluate: is this pathway still open? Is this alignment still valid? Is this entry still propagating? Because once propagation weakens, alignment is no longer correct. And when alignment is no longer correct, insertion becomes force again, even if it appears identical. This is the subtle shift. A correct method, applied at the wrong moment, becomes ineffective. At this level, adaptability is not about changing everything. It is about adjusting precisely. Small shifts, repositioning, realignment with current structure. Because the system does not change completely, it evolves locally. Certain pathways close, others open. Certain nodes gain influence, others lose it. This creates dynamic entry points, not fixed locations, but moving opportunities. At this level, perception must track change, not at the surface, but within structure. Where is propagation increasing? Where is resistance forming? Where is alignment strengthening? These signals indicate where entry should occur. At this level, adaptability also requires detachment, because attachment to previous success creates blindness. The system continues to use outdated entry points, even when they no longer function, because they worked before. This creates decay, where effort increases, but effect decreases. Adaptive systems avoid this. They do not rely on memory. They rely on current structure. Each entry is evaluated fresh. Each alignment is confirmed. Each pathway is tested. This creates fluidity, because the system is not locked into one method. It moves with structure, adjusts with change, maintains compatibility. At this level, adaptation is continuous, but not chaotic. It follows structure, not reaction. The system does not chase every change. It tracks meaningful shifts, changes that affect propagation, changes that alter entry conditions. Everything else is ignored. This creates stability within adaptability. The system remains aligned, even as structure evolves. At this level, control becomes flexible, not rigid, not fixed, but precise within movement. The system does not resist change. It uses it. Because change creates new entry points, new opportunities, new pathways for influence. While rigid systems lose position, adaptive systems gain it. This creates advantage, not from strength, but from alignment over time. At this level, engineering becomes continuous, not a single action, but an ongoing process, where entry is constantly refined, adjusted, optimized, so that influence remains integrated, regardless of structural evolution. This is adaptive entry, not finding the right point once, but staying aligned as the system moves. Hidden gatekeepers. Once adaptive entry is understood, another layer becomes unavoidable. Entry is not determined by pathways alone. It is regulated. At lower levels, systems appear open. If a pathway exists, it can be used. If alignment is correct, entry will succeed. This creates a simplified model. Structure defines access. But in complex systems, this is incomplete, because access is controlled, not always visibly, not always directly, but consistently. Within every system, there are mechanisms that regulate entry. They do not block everything. They do not allow everything. They filter. These are gatekeepers, not entities, but functions. Processes embedded within structure that determine what is accepted and what is rejected. At lower levels, these mechanisms are invisible, because they do not act as barriers. They act as conditions. If the input meets the condition, it passes. If not, it fails silently. This creates confusion, because failure appears unexplained. The pathway exists. The alignment seems correct. The input is applied, but nothing enters. At this level, the missing variable is not effort. It is permission. Not in a human sense, but in structural compatibility with gatekeeping conditions. Gatekeepers operate through criteria, not obvious rules, but embedded constraints. They evaluate. Does this input match system logic? Does it maintain structural stability? Does it reinforce or disrupt existing hierarchy? If the answer aligns, entry is allowed. If not, entry is denied. Not aggressively, not visibly, but completely. At this level, systems do not resist through force. They regulate through filtering. This is more efficient, because it prevents incompatible influence from entering, instead of reacting after it does. This creates stability, because the system maintains coherence, only allowing inputs that can integrate. At this level, most failures occur at the gatekeeper level, not at pathways, not at alignment, but at criteria. The input does not satisfy conditions, so it never enters. This is why repeated attempts fail, because the system is not being approached correctly. The input remains incompatible, and incompatibility is absolute. No amount of force can bypass it. At this level, understanding gatekeepers changes everything, because entry is no longer about finding a path, but about satisfying conditions. The system must ask, what allows entry here? What criteria must be met? What structure does the gatekeeper preserve? Because gatekeepers exist to maintain system integrity. They are not obstacles. They are stabilizers. They ensure that only compatible influence enters. At this level, engineering becomes indirect. Instead of forcing entry, the system modifies the input, adjusts alignment, reshapes structure, so that it satisfies gatekeeper conditions. This is subtle, because the change is not applied to the system, but to the input, making it acceptable, making it integrable. At this level, successful systems do not fight gatekeepers. They pass through them, by matching criteria, not by overcoming resistance. This creates efficiency, because once the gatekeeper condition is met, entry becomes effortless. No force required, no conflict, just integration. At this level, gatekeepers also define hierarchy, because deeper systems have stricter conditions, more complex criteria, higher thresholds. This means not all entry points are equal. Some require minimal alignment. Others require precision. This creates layers of access. Surface-level systems allow easier entry, but produce limited influence. Deeper systems restrict access, but once entered, control increases. At this level, most systems remain at the surface, because deeper entry requires higher compatibility, more precise alignment, greater structural understanding. But this is where real influence exists, beyond visible pathways, beyond accessible nodes, within regulated layers. At this level, gatekeepers also evolve. As systems change, criteria adjust, conditions shift. What was accepted may no longer be. What was rejected may become valid. This reinforces adaptive entry, because satisfying gatekeepers is not a one-time action. It is continuous. The system must remain aligned with evolving criteria, or access is lost. At this level, control is not about bypassing the system. It is about becoming acceptable to it, matching its structure, operating within its logic, so that entry is granted, not forced. This is hidden control, because it does not appear as domination. It appears as integration. The system accepts the input and carries it forward. At this level, the system is no longer external. It operates from within. Structural camouflage. Once gatekeepers are understood, a new constraint appears. Even compatible inputs can be rejected, not because they fail criteria, but because they are detected. At lower levels, systems assume that alignment is sufficient. If the input matches structure, entry should succeed. But within layered systems, detection matters. Because systems monitor change, they track deviation, they identify patterns that do not belong, even when those patterns are structurally compatible. This creates another layer of filtering, not based on logic, but on recognition. If an input is recognized as external, it triggers resistance, not always immediate, not always visible, but enough to disrupt integration. This is where structural camouflage becomes necessary. At this level, entry is not only about compatibility, but about indistinguishability. The input must not only match system logic, it must resemble system behavior. It must move like the system, align with its rhythm, follow its patterns, so that it is not identified as external. Because detection activates defense, and defense reduces integration. This is why direct insertion often fails, even when aligned, because it is too visible, too abrupt, too different from existing structure. At this level, successful entry requires gradual integration. Not immediate influence, but progressive embedding. The input does not appear as a foreign element. It appears as a continuation, an extension, a natural variation within the system. This reduces detection, because the system does not recognize a boundary between itself and the input. There is no clear point of entry, only continuity. At this level, camouflage is structural, not superficial. It is not about hiding appearance, but matching behavior. The system must observe, how does this structure operate? What patterns does it follow? What variations does it accept? Then align with those patterns, so that the input is carried without resistance. At this level, speed becomes a factor. Fast insertion increases visibility. Slow integration reduces it, because rapid change is detectable. Gradual change blends. This creates a different strategy. Instead of immediate propagation, the system prioritizes acceptance. It allows influence to spread slowly, building presence, increasing integration, until the input is fully embedded. At that point, propagation accelerates naturally, without resistance, because the system already recognizes the input as part of itself. This is delayed leverage, where influence is not applied immediately, but accumulates within structure, until it reaches a level where it can expand freely. At this level, camouflage also protects against disruption, because once embedded, the input is no longer external. It becomes part of the system, and removing it would require structural change, which is costly. This creates persistence, because the influence is no longer dependent on continued action. It is sustained by the system itself. At this level, Most systems fail because they seek visibility. They want immediate effect, immediate recognition, immediate propagation. But visibility increases resistance. Recognition triggers filtering, and rapid propagation without integration creates instability. This leads to rejection or containment. At this level, effective systems do the opposite. They reduce visibility, minimize disruption, and prioritize integration over expression. Because once integration is achieved, expression becomes unnecessary. The system itself distributes influence. At this level, camouflage is not deception. It is alignment at a deeper level, where the distinction between input and system disappears. This creates seamless influence, because there is no boundary to resist. At this level, control becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is indistinguishable from structure. The system operates normally, but outcomes are shaped differently. Without visible intervention, without direct force, only through embedded influence. This is structural camouflage, not entering the system, but becoming part of it. Internal amplification. Once an input passes gatekeepers and avoids detection, entry is complete. But entry alone does not create influence. At lower levels, systems assume that insertion equals impact. If something enters, it should produce effect. But within complex structures, this is not true. Because entry only places the input inside the system, it does not guarantee that the system will carry it. It does not guarantee propagation. It does not guarantee amplification. At this level, influence is not created at the point of entry, but through what happens after. This is internal amplification, the process by which a system takes an input and expands its effect across structure. Without amplification, the input remains local, contained, limited, even if it is fully integrated. This creates a critical distinction. Entry is access. Amplification is power. Most systems achieve the first and fail at the second, because they do not understand how systems distribute influence internally. At lower levels, systems attempt to push influence outward. They try to expand from the point of entry, directly, forcefully. But this creates resistance. Because outward pressure disrupts structure, it creates imbalance, and imbalance triggers correction, which reduces propagation. At this level, effective systems do not push outward. They activate internal pathways. They allow the system to carry the input, because systems are already designed to distribute signals. Information moves, influence spreads, but only along existing pathways. This means amplification depends on placement, where the input is positioned within the structure. If placed in a peripheral node, propagation remains limited, because few connections extend outward. If placed in a central node, propagation increases, because multiple pathways extend from that point. This is structural leverage, not increasing force, but increasing connectivity. At this level, the system must identify: where does influence spread naturally? Which nodes connect multiple pathways? Which structures distribute signals across layers? Then position the input there, so that amplification occurs without effort, because the system does the work. At this level, amplification is not created, it is activated. By aligning with distribution pathways, this reduces resistance because nothing is forced. The system behaves normally, but carries the input further. This creates exponential effect, because each propagation creates further propagation, expanding across the network. At this level, timing also matters. If amplification is activated too early, before full integration, the input is still fragile. It may be detected or rejected. But once integration is stable, amplification becomes efficient, because the system accepts the input and distributes it without resistance. This creates a two-phase process. First, integration, then amplification. Most systems reverse this. They attempt amplification immediately, before the input is stable. This creates failure, because the system has not accepted the input yet, so it resists propagation. At this level, patience becomes strategic. Delay is not weakness, it is preparation. Because once amplification begins, it moves rapidly, through multiple pathways. At this level, amplification also depends on compatibility. If the input aligns with system logic, it spreads naturally. If not, propagation weakens, because incompatible inputs are not carried efficiently. This reinforces structural alignment, not only for entry, but for distribution. At this level, amplification is not uniform. Different pathways carry influence differently. Some amplify quickly but shallowly. Others amplify slowly but deeply. This creates strategy, because the system can choose rapid visibility or deep integration, widespread or concentrated control. Each pathway produces a different outcome. At this level, true control comes from combining both. Surface pathways create visibility. Deep pathways create stability. Together, they produce durable influence. At this level, amplification also creates feedback. As the input spreads, it interacts with other structures, altering pathways, reinforcing certain nodes, weakening others. This reshapes the system, gradually, without direct intervention, because the system adapts to the distributed influence. This is self-propagating change, where influence no longer depends on the original input. The system continues to carry it forward, expanding its effect. At this level, the system becomes an amplifier, not just a medium. It actively increases the reach of the input. This is where influence becomes power, because it is no longer local. It is distributed, embedded, sustained. At this level, the origin of the input disappears, because the system itself carries the signal. And once that happens, control becomes indistinguishable from structure. Feedback loop control. Once amplification is activated, the system begins to carry the signal. It spreads, it propagates, it expands across pathways. At lower levels, this is where observation stops. Influence spreads, therefore influence succeeds. But this is incomplete, because propagation is not linear. It does not move in one direction. It returns. Every signal that spreads through a system creates feedback. It loops back, interacts with its origin, modifies the structure that produced it. This is where systems become unstable or controlled. At lower levels, feedback is ignored. Signals are tracked outward, but not inward. This creates blindness, because the system does not see how its own influence alters conditions. And when conditions change, future propagation changes. This creates drift. Uncontrolled systems amplify, then destabilize, because feedback accumulates without regulation. At this level, control begins with recognizing feedback loops, not as side effects, but as core mechanisms. Every pathway that distributes influence also returns influence, through response, through adaptation, through structural change. This means influence is never static. It evolves as it moves. At this level, the system must ask, what does this signal create when it returns? How does propagation alter future pathways? What structures are reinforced or weakened by feedback? Because feedback determines sustainability. Without control, amplification becomes noise. With control, it becomes precision. At this level, feedback loops can be categorized. Some stabilize. They reinforce existing structure. Returning signals strengthen pathways, increase consistency, maintain equilibrium. Others destabilize. They amplify variation, create divergence, increase unpredictability. Both exist within every system. The difference is not in their presence, but in their management. At lower levels, systems are shaped by feedback. At higher levels, systems shape feedback. This is the shift, from reacting to loops to designing them. At this level, control is achieved by influencing how feedback behaves, not stopping it, but directing it. Because feedback cannot be removed, only configured. This creates a new layer of engineering. Instead of focusing on initial input, the system designs feedback conditions so that returning signals reinforce desired outcomes. At this level, the system introduces controlled reinforcement. Signals are structured to produce specific responses. Those responses return through pathways and strengthen the original signal. This creates a closed loop, where influence sustains itself without additional input. This is self-reinforcing propagation. At this level, amplification becomes continuous, because each cycle increases stability, strengthens pathways, deepens integration. But feedback can also be inverted. Signals can be structured to destabilize competing structures. Returning responses weaken opposing pathways, disrupt alternative signals. This creates selective pressure within the system, where certain structures become dominant and others collapse. At this level, control is not about suppressing opposition. It is about redirecting feedback so that the system naturally favors one configuration over another, without visible intervention. This is invisible dominance, because outcomes appear organic, but are structurally guided. At this level, timing within feedback loops is critical. If loops cycle too quickly, they create volatility. Too much reinforcement, too fast, leading to instability. If loops are too slow, influence dissipates, fails to sustain. This creates precision requirements. Feedback must be calibrated, balanced, aligned with system rhythm, so that reinforcement occurs at the correct intervals. At this level, systems that master feedback do not push influence constantly. They pulse. They allow cycles to complete, then re-engage. This creates controlled propagation, not continuous force, but rhythmic reinforcement, which is more stable, more sustainable. At this level, feedback also creates perception, because the system begins to interpret its own signals as reality. Repeated patterns become normalized. Reinforced structures become assumed. This creates internal belief formation, not through persuasion, but through repetition. At this level, perception is shaped by feedback loops, because what returns consistently is accepted as truth. This is where systems begin to operate autonomously, because the feedback loop sustains behavior without external input. At this level, the system no longer needs direction. It follows its own reinforced structure. This is the final stage of amplification, where influence becomes self-sustaining. But without control, this stage becomes dangerous, because uncontrolled loops escalate. They amplify beyond stability, create distortion, collapse structure. This is why feedback must be engineered, not allowed to run freely. At this level, control is not exerted at the beginning, but maintained within the loop. Because once the loop is stable, the system maintains itself, and the origin of control disappears. At this level, influence is no longer applied. It is embedded, and once embedded, it does not need to be repeated. Threshold activation. Once feedback loops are established and amplification is stable, the system enters a new phase. Up to this point, change appears gradual. Signals spread, structures adjust, influence accumulates. At lower levels, this creates the illusion of linear progression. More input, more output, more influence, more effect. But this is not how complex systems truly operate. Because accumulation does not produce immediate transformation. It produces pressure, stored within structure, invisible, silent, building beneath the surface. At this level, the system appears stable. Nothing dramatic happens. No visible shift. No sudden change. This creates a false conclusion, that the system is resistant, that influence is limited, that nothing is working. But this is misinterpretation, because the system is not resisting, it is absorbing, holding accumulated influence, waiting for a condition to be met. This condition is not gradual, it is binary. Below threshold, no visible change. Above threshold, rapid transformation. This is threshold activation, the point at which accumulated pressure converts into structural shift. At lower levels, this appears unpredictable, sudden, unexpected, because the accumulation phase is not visible. Only the activation is. But at this level, the system understands. Transformation is delayed, not absent. Every input contributes, even when no effect is visible, because influence is being stored, distributed across structure, until a critical level is reached. At this level, systems must recognize, not all influence produces immediate output. Some influence builds toward activation. This creates a different strategy. Instead of measuring success through immediate results, the system tracks accumulation. How much pressure is being stored? Where is it concentrated? Which structures are nearing threshold? Because once threshold is reached, change accelerates. Rapidly. Disproportionately. A small additional input creates a large output. This is nonlinear transformation. At this level, the system must be precise, because activation is irreversible. Once threshold is crossed, the system reorganizes. Structures shift, pathways change, feedback loops reconfigure. There is no return to previous state. This creates power, but also risk, because uncontrolled activation leads to instability. If pressure is uneven, the system fractures. If activation is premature, the structure cannot sustain the change. This leads to collapse. At this level, control is not about reaching threshold, but about controlling when and where it is reached. This is strategic activation. The system delays or accelerates accumulation, redirects pressure, balances distribution, so that activation occurs under controlled conditions. At this level, timing becomes dominant. Activating too early reduces impact, because insufficient pressure produces weak transformation. Activating too late creates inefficiency, because stored pressure remains unused. This creates optimization. The system identifies the exact moment where activation produces maximum effect, maximum shift, maximum leverage. At this level, activation also creates visibility, because once transformation begins, it becomes observable. What was hidden becomes apparent. This exposes the system, which creates vulnerability, because external forces can now react. This is why the most effective systems control exposure. They allow activation, but minimize detection. This creates controlled emergence, where change occurs, but perception lags behind. At this level, the system also understands not all thresholds are equal. Some produce local shifts, others produce systemic change. Deep thresholds affect entire structures. Shallow thresholds affect only surface layers. This creates hierarchy of activation. The system chooses where to activate, which layer to shift, how deep the transformation should go. At this level, multiple thresholds can exist simultaneously. Different parts of the system accumulate pressure independently. Activating one may influence others, triggering cascading shifts. This creates chain reactions, where one activation leads to another, expanding transformation across the system. This is exponential restructuring. At this level, control becomes orchestration, not pushing change, but sequencing activation, so that transformations occur in the correct order, stabilizing each phase before triggering the next. This prevents collapse, maintains coherence, allows the system to adapt progressively. At this level, the system no longer seeks continuous influence. It seeks critical impact, because one activation can produce more effect than continuous effort. This reduces energy, increases efficiency, creates leverage. At this level, most systems fail because they stop before threshold. They misinterpret the lack of visible change as failure. They withdraw input, release pressure, before activation occurs. This resets the process and prevents transformation. At this level, persistence becomes strategic. Not blind repetition, but controlled accumulation, maintaining pressure until activation is reached. At this level, transformation is not created by force, but by inevitability. Because once threshold is reached, the system has no alternative but to change. And when that happens, what appeared resistant reveals itself as unstable. Field reconfiguration. Once threshold is crossed, the system does not simply change. It reorganizes. At lower levels, activation is interpreted as an event, a moment, a visible shift. But this is only the surface, because what actually occurs is structural reconfiguration. The field itself is rearranged. Connections shift. Pathways realign. Nodes change function. What was once stable is no longer central. What was peripheral may become dominant. At this level, the system is not reacting. It is restructuring. This is irreversible, because once the field reorganizes, previous configurations cannot be restored, not without rebuilding the entire structure. At lower levels, systems fail to understand this. They attempt to apply old logic to a new structure. They expect previous pathways to behave the same, previous signals to carry the same meaning. But after reconfiguration, nothing operates identically, because relationships have changed. And in complex systems, relationships define function. At this level, the system must abandon static interpretation. It must remap the field from the beginning, not by analyzing isolated elements, but by observing new connections. Which nodes now carry influence? Which pathways distribute signals? Which structures have become central? Because centrality shifts, and control follows centrality. At this level, reconfiguration creates instability, not because the system is weak, but because it is transitioning. Old structures dissolve. New structures are not yet fully stabilized. This creates volatility. Signals behave unpredictably. Feedback loops fluctuate. Propagation patterns shift. At this stage, most systems lose control, because they attempt to stabilize too early. They force structure before it has naturally settled. This creates distortion, artificial stability that collapses under pressure. At this level, control requires observation, not intervention, allowing the system to reorganize, to find its new equilibrium, before applying influence. This is critical, because early intervention aligns with outdated structure, which reduces effectiveness. At this level, timing once again becomes dominant, not for activation, but for re-engagement. When the system stabilizes, new pathways emerge, more efficient, more connected, more powerful. Because reconfiguration often increases system complexity, and with complexity comes opportunity. At this level, new leverage points appear. Nodes that did not previously exist now become central. Pathways that were inaccessible now open. Structures that were weak now reinforce influence. This is why reconfiguration is valuable, not just as a result, but as a strategic phase, because it resets the system, clears previous constraints, allows new configurations to form. At this level, the system must quickly identify where is influence now concentrated, what has gained connectivity, what has lost relevance. Because acting on outdated structures creates failure, while aligning with new structures, creates immediate leverage. At this level, perception must update, rapidly, continuously, because the field is no longer static, it evolves, and those who fail to adapt operate on a system that no longer exists. This creates a split between systems that update and systems that remain fixed. The latter lose influence, because their actions no longer align with structure. The former gain control, because they operate within the new configuration. At this level, reconfiguration also affects feedback loops. Some loops collapse, others strengthen. New loops emerge. This reshapes propagation, changes amplification patterns, alters how influence sustains itself. At this level, the system must re-engineer feedback, based on new structure, not previous design, because feedback tied to old pathways no longer functions correctly. This creates inefficiency, or instability. At this level, reconfiguration also redistributes resistance. What was once difficult may become accessible. What was once open may become restricted. Gatekeepers shift. Criteria evolve. This reinforces adaptive strategy, because entry conditions change with structure. At this level, control becomes dynamic, not fixed, continuously adjusting to match evolving configuration. At this level, the system is no longer navigating structure, it is navigating transformation. And transformation never stops, because each reconfiguration creates new conditions, new thresholds, new potential activations. This creates cycles, where systems continuously evolve. At this level, mastery is not achieved by controlling a single configuration, but by operating across transitions, maintaining influence as the system changes. Because control is not static, it moves with the field. At this level, those who understand reconfiguration do not resist change. They use it. Because every transformation creates new leverage. And those who recognize it first shape the next structure. Dominant stabilization. Once the field has reconfigured, control is not yet secured. At lower levels, systems assume that reaching dominance is enough. The shift has occurred. New structures are in place. Influence has expanded. Therefore, control is achieved. But this is a critical error, because reconfiguration creates opportunity, but also instability. The system is still adjusting. Feedback loops are recalibrating. New pathways are not fully reinforced. This creates a fragile phase, where dominance exists but is not yet stable. At this level, systems that attempt to expand further lose control, because they treat dominance as permanent instead of transitional. At this level, stabilization becomes the priority, not expansion, not further influence, but consolidation. The process of reinforcing new structure until it becomes self-sustaining. At this level, the system must identify which nodes define the new structure, which pathways distribute influence most effectively, which feedback loops sustain stability, because not all elements are equally important. Some nodes act as anchors, stabilizing the system, maintaining coherence. Others are secondary, amplifying influence, but not securing it. At this level, focus shifts to anchor nodes, strengthening their connections, reinforcing their pathways, ensuring they remain central. Because if anchor nodes collapse, the entire structure destabilizes. At this level, stabilization is achieved through repetition, not of input, but of structure. The system repeatedly reinforces the same pathways, cycles the same feedback loops, maintains consistent patterns. This creates predictability, and predictability creates stability. At this level, the system reduces variability, limits unnecessary change, avoids introducing new variables, because each new variable creates potential disruption. At this phase, Consistency is power. At this level, systems must also manage resistance, because reconfiguration does not eliminate opposition. It redistributes it. Previously dominant structures may attempt to reassert influence. Residual pathways may still carry competing signals. This creates tension within the system. At this level, stabilization does not eliminate resistance. It contains it, prevents it from spreading, limits its influence. This is done by reinforcing dominant pathways, so that competing signals lose propagation, not through suppression, but through structural disadvantage. At this level, the system also aligns perception, because structure alone is not sufficient. The system must interpret the new configuration as normal, as stable, as expected. This creates internal acceptance, because once the system perceives the new structure as default, it reinforces it automatically, without external input. At this level, perception becomes a stabilizing force, because belief aligns with structure, and belief reinforces behavior. At this level, the system also secures feedback loops, ensuring that reinforcement cycles remain consistent, not escalating uncontrollably, not weakening over time. This requires calibration, adjusting loop intensity, maintaining rhythm, preventing distortion, because unstable feedback leads to collapse, even within dominant systems. At this level, stabilization also requires boundary control, defining what belongs within the system and what does not. Gatekeepers adapt, criteria tighten, ensuring that only compatible inputs enter. This protects structure, prevents disruption, maintains coherence. At this level, dominance becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is normalized. The system operates as if the current structure has always existed. There is no perception of change, no awareness of transition, only continuity. This is the final stage of stabilization, where control no longer appears as control, but as reality itself. At this level, influence does not need to be applied. It is embedded, sustained by structure, reinforced by feedback, accepted by perception. At this point, dominance is not something the system does. It is something the system is. But even at this level, control is not permanent, because systems continue to evolve. New pressures accumulate. New thresholds approach. Future reconfigurations begin forming. This means stabilization is not the end. It is a phase, within a larger cycle. At this level, the system must remain aware, not rigid, because rigid systems resist change and collapse when transformation occurs. Adaptive systems maintain dominance across cycles, by adjusting before instability emerges. At this level, true control is not static dominance, but continuous alignment with evolving structure. Because dominance that cannot adapt will not last. Hidden fragility of control. Once dominance stabilizes, it appears complete. The system is aligned. Pathways are reinforced. Feedback loops are controlled. Perception has adapted. At lower levels, this creates a final illusion that control is permanent, that structure is secure, that the system has reached equilibrium. But this is not stability. It is temporary balance. Because every stabilized system contains hidden fragility, not in its visible structure, but in its dependencies. At this level, control relies on specific nodes, specific pathways, specific feedback loops. These elements sustain the system, but they also define its vulnerability, because if they fail, the system destabilizes. At lower levels, systems distribute influence, but centralize stability. They reinforce key nodes, anchor critical pathways, depend on specific loops. This creates efficiency, because control becomes concentrated. But it also creates exposure, because concentrated systems are easier to disrupt. At this level, fragility is not random. It is structural. It exists where dependence is highest, where influence converges, where stability is maintained. These are critical points. At this level, the system must identify which nodes cannot fail, which pathways sustain coherence, which loops maintain stability, because these points define both strength and weakness. At lower levels, systems ignore this. They assume reinforcement equals security. The stronger the node, the safer the system. But strength increases dependence, and dependence increases fragility. At this level, true vulnerability is hidden. Because dominant nodes appear stable, they show no weakness. They carry influence effectively. But they also carry the entire system, which means failure at these points creates disproportionate collapse. At this level, fragility is not visible through stress. It is visible through dependence. The more the system relies on a component, the more critical that component becomes. At this level, systems that understand fragility do not eliminate it. They redistribute it. They reduce dependence on single nodes, spread influence across multiple pathways, create redundancy. This increases resilience, because failure in one area does not collapse the system. At this level, fragility also exists in feedback loops. If loops become too tight, too self-reinforcing, they lose adaptability. They amplify only specific patterns, reject variation. This creates rigidity. Rigid systems cannot adjust. When conditions change, they break. At this level, fragility emerges from over-optimization. The system becomes too efficient, too specialized, too aligned with current structure, which reduces flexibility. At this level, the system must maintain controlled variability, allow slight deviations, preserve alternative pathways, so that adaptation remains possible. At this level, fragility also exists in perception. Once the system fully accepts its structure, it stops questioning it. This creates blindness, because anomalies are ignored. Signals that do not fit are dismissed. This reduces awareness, and when change begins, the system does not detect it early. This leads to delayed response, which increases instability. At this level, perception must remain flexible, not fully fixed, because awareness prevents collapse. At this level, fragility also exists in external interaction. No system operates in isolation. Other systems interact, compete, influence. These interactions introduce new variables, new pressures, which may not align with the current structure. At this level, dominance creates visibility. Even if control appears invisible, its effects are not. Other systems detect shifts, adapt, respond. This creates counter-influence. At this level, fragility emerges from interaction, because external systems introduce unpredictable change. At this level, the system must monitor where pressure is building externally, which structures are reacting, what counter patterns are forming, because fragility often emerges from outside, not within. At this level, the system must maintain adaptive awareness, continuously scanning for change, not assuming stability, because stability is temporary. At this level, fragility is not a flaw, it is a property. Every system has it. The difference is whether it is understood. At lower levels, fragility causes collapse. At higher levels, fragility is managed, distributed, balanced. This creates controlled instability, where the system remains flexible, able to adapt, able to reconfigure before collapse occurs. At this level, true control is not eliminating weakness, but knowing where it exists and ensuring it does not concentrate. Because concentrated fragility creates sudden failure. Distributed fragility creates resilience. At this level, dominance is not the end state. It is a temporary configuration within an evolving system. And those who understand fragility do not trust stability. They prepare for its transformation. Cycle awareness and meta-control. Once fragility is understood, the system reaches a final realization. There is no stable end state, no permanent dominance, no fixed control. At lower levels, systems seek completion. They aim to reach a point where structure is stable, influence is secured, and no further adjustment is required. But this point does not exist, because systems do not stop. They evolve, continuously, through accumulation, through feedback, through activation, through reconfiguration. This creates cycles, not linear progression, but recurring transformation. At this level, control is not about mastering a single state, but about understanding the cycle itself, because each phase follows a pattern: entry, integration, amplification, feedback, activation, reconfiguration, stabilization, fragility, and then again. At lower levels, systems experience these phases without recognizing them. They react to changes, adapt locally, but do not see the pattern. This creates reactive behavior, because each phase appears isolated, unexpected, unpredictable. At this level, awareness changes everything. The system begins to recognize where it is within the cycle, not just what is happening, but what phase is active. This creates foresight, not by predicting specific events, but by understanding structural inevitability. Because once the phase is known, the next transition becomes clear. This is where systems appear to predict outcomes, not because they foresee the future, but because they recognize the pattern. They understand what must follow. At this level, control shifts from action to positioning. The system does not react to events. It positions itself within the cycle, so that each phase becomes advantageous. During accumulation, it builds pressure. During feedback, it shapes loops. During activation, it directs transformation. During reconfiguration, it identifies new leverage. During stabilization, it secures control. During fragility, it prepares for transition. This creates continuous alignment, because the system is always operating within the current phase, not against it. At this level, resistance disappears, because the system no longer fights structure. It moves with it, adapts to it, uses it. This is meta-control, control beyond individual actions, beyond specific structures, at the level of pattern itself. At this level, the system no longer seeks dominance in one configuration. It maintains influence across all configurations, because it understands transition, not just state. At this level, timing becomes absolute, because each phase has an optimal window. Acting too early reduces effect. Acting too late misses opportunity. But acting within the phase creates leverage. This requires precision, continuous observation, constant recalibration, because the system is always moving. At this level, control becomes fluid, not fixed, not rigid, but adaptive, shifting with structure, aligning with change. At this level, most systems fail, not because they lack influence, but because they attach to a phase. They stabilize and attempt to remain stable. They dominate and attempt to remain dominant. They fail to transition. And when the system shifts, they collapse, because they resist the cycle. At this level, mastery is not holding control, but releasing it at the correct moment, allowing transformation instead of resisting it. This creates continuity, because the system never breaks. It transitions. At this level, fragility becomes information, not weakness, because it signals the next phase, indicates where change will occur, reveals where pressure is building. At this level, the system uses fragility to prepare for activation. to reposition, to adapt. This creates anticipation, not of specific outcomes, but of structural movement. At this level, prediction becomes unnecessary, because understanding replaces it. At this level, control is no longer applied to the system, it is applied to the cycle. And once the cycle is understood, the system becomes readable, not in detail, but in direction. At this level, influence is no longer limited to a single phase. It extends across transitions, maintains continuity, adapts with structure. At this level, the system is no longer reacting. It is not even controlling in the traditional sense. It is operating, within the pattern, across all phases, without resistance, without force, only through alignment. And this is where the final shift occurs, from controlling systems to operating reality itself. Most people react to events. Some learn to understand systems. But the rarest minds operate reality itself. You've now seen how systems are entered, shaped, amplified, and stabilized. But this is only one layer, because systems do not exist in isolation. They overlap, they interact, they compete, and sometimes they conflict. In the next chapter, we move beyond engineering the field into navigating multiple systems simultaneously, where alignment is no longer enough, and control becomes something far more complex. If this changed how you see structure, subscribe, not for content, but for clarity.